Hello and welcome. Now we all love a good story about a war-winning machine, don't we? The Spitfire dancing through the skies over Kent. The Mustang, a silver bullet escorting bombers to Berlin. The Lancaster droning through the night. They're the heroes, the legends, the posters on a schoolboy's wall. They are, if you will, the Ferraris, the Porsches of the Second World War. Fast, beautiful, utterly brilliant at what they were designed to do. But what about the others? What about the ones that weren't quite so brilliant? For every masterpiece of aeronautical engineering there was, inevitably, a complete and utter catastrophe. These are the airborne lemons, the flying coffins, the utter duds that somehow made it off the drawing board and into the air, much to everyone's regret. So strap yourselves in, but not too tightly, you might want to bail out. Let's dive into the sky's biggest flops of the Second World War. Kicking off our list of airborne embarrassments is a British creation, and I say that with a heavy heart. It's the Blackburn Rock. Now the theory behind this thing was, on the surface, not completely mad. The idea was to create a turret fighter. Instead of guns pointing forward like a normal airplane, the Rock's entire armament was packed into a massive, hydraulically powered dorsal turret. The pilot's job was to fly the plane near the enemy, and a gunner would do the shooting. Sounds a bit like a designated driver for a drive-by shooting, doesn't it? For this to work, the plane needs to be, and this is crucial, fast. The gunner must be able to draw a bead on a nimble enemy fighter. The Rock was based on the Blackburn Skua dive bomber, which was no spring chicken. Slow, agonizingly, catastrophically slow. Imagine trying to chase a Greyhound on a mobility scooter. Its top speed was a pathetic 223 miles per hour. And that's without the turret pointing sideways, which added so much drag it could nearly stop the plane. A Messerschmitt 109, by comparison, zipped at over 350 miles per hour. The Rock couldn't catch anything, and it certainly couldn't run away. It was a sitting duck, a clay pigeon waiting for the shot. The turret was another bag of spanners, cramped, hard to aim, and mechanically unreliable. Communication between pilot and gunner was a shouting match over the engine. "He's over there!" "Where?" "All I can see is our own tail." A committee-born concept that never faced the brutal reality of dogfighting. Unsurprisingly, the Rock's combat career was more whimper than bang. Credited with a single disputed air-to-air victory, most ended up as humiliating target tugs, dragging drogues for real fighters. A fighter so bad its only useful purpose was to be a target for better planes. That is a spectacular level of failure. The Blackburn Rock, a good idea on paper that became an absolute shambles in the sky. It was a fighter that couldn't fight, a protector that couldn't protect. Heavy, slow, underarmed, risking crews for no reason. A magnificent opening contender for the worst of the worst. Next up, we have an American machine that earned a truly unfortunate reputation, especially with the poor souls who had to fly it in combat. This is the Brewster F-2A Buffalo. Now, when you look at it, it doesn't seem too bad. It's short, it's stubby. It looks a bit like a barrel with wings. It was the US Navy's first monoplane fighter. In the late 1930s, it seemed like a step in the right direction. The early models, flown by the Finnish Air Force, actually did surprisingly well against the Soviets. The Finns were brilliant pilots, and they were flying a lightweight version of the plane. They loved it, calling it the Sky Pearl. However, the version that the US, British, and Commonwealth forces received was a different beast entirely. It had been improved, loaded up with extra equipment, more armor, more fuel, heavier guns. Our next contender for the Hall of Shame, another one from the "it seemed like a good idea at the time" file, it's the Boulton-Paul Defiant. Unlike the Rock, the Defiant was designed from the ground up as a fighter. It even had a powerful Merlin engine. So far so good. However, it had no forward-firing guns. At all. Zero. The pilot had nothing to shoot with. His job? Position the aircraft so the gunner in the massive turret could fire. The theory? Fly alongside bomber formations. Fly below bomber formations. Let the turret do its deadly work. For a very brief, shining moment, this worked. Over Dunkirk, German pilots were baffled. They saw what looked like a hurricane. They dived on its tail, then were shredded by 4.303 Brownings. The crews became heroes, briefly, but the Germans adapted fast. They spotted the Achilles heel, no forward guns. They stopped attacking from the rear. They stopped attacking from the side. They attacked head-on, or from below, where the turret couldn't aim. Suddenly the hunter became the hunted. The Defiant was a sitting duck. A Bf-109 could fly straight at it, cannons blazing. The British pilot could only try to get out of the way. The huge turret and extra crew made the plane heavier and less maneuverable. In dogfights, it was outclassed. Kill-loss ratios crashed. Defiants were withdrawn from daylight operations after horrific losses at the Battle of Britain. It later served as a night fighter. At night, the turret could be an advantage against lumbering bombers, but as a day fighter it was a catastrophic failure. A one-trick pony whose trick was figured out almost immediately. A lesson in why you should always give the pilot a gun. We now move to Germany for our next exhibit, a machine so notoriously flammable it was nicknamed the Luftwaffenfeuerzeug, the Luftwaffe's lighter. This is the Heinkel He 177 Greif, or Griffin. On paper, this was supposed to be Germany's answer to the Allied four-engine heavy bombers like the Lancaster B-17. It was intended to be a long-range strategic bomber capable of striking deep into enemy territory, a worthy ambition. The project, however, was cursed from the start by one of the most idiotic requirements ever foisted upon an aircraft designer. The German Air Ministry insisted that this massive 30-ton heavy bomber had to be capable of dive bombing. This is like demanding a double-decker bus be able to do a handbrake turn. This single absurd requirement had catastrophic consequences for the design. To reduce drag for the dive, the designers decided not to use 4 separate engines. Instead, they coupled 2 engines together into a single nacelle on each wing, each pair driving a single propeller. These were the Daimler-Benz DB606 power systems, and they were an unmitigated disaster. Incredibly complex, crammed tightly together and generating a colossal amount of heat. Oil and fuel lines would frequently leak onto the scorching hot exhaust manifolds. The result was predictable and terrifying: fires. The He 177 had a horrifying tendency to spontaneously burst into flames in mid-air, often for no apparent reason. Engine fires were so common that crews flew in constant fear of their own aircraft. Even when they weren't on fire, the engines were unreliable and underpowered for such a heavy airframe. The plane was difficult to handle, and its complex systems were a constant source of trouble. The dive bombing requirement also meant the entire airframe had to be strengthened, adding yet more weight and further straining the already overburdened engines. It was a vicious cycle of terrible engineering decisions. While a few He 177s did see service, they never fulfilled their role as a strategic bomber force. They were used for anti-shipping, as transports, and even for launching guided missiles, but their operational record was plagued by mechanical failures and accidents. The Greif is the perfect monument to what happens when bureaucracy and nonsensical requirements override common sense. It wasn't a warplane, it was an airborne pyre, a flying barbecue just waiting for a spark. At number 5, one of the most radical and terrifying aircraft ever to fly, the Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet, a rocket with a man strapped to it. The only operational rocket-powered fighter. Performance, breathtaking. Climb, over 11,000 feet per minute, altitudes no Allied plane could touch, faster than anything in the sky. So why is it on the worst aircraft list? Because brilliant as a rocket, lethal as an airplane, Walter HWK 109, 509 rocket motor, powered by a hypergolic fuel mixture, mix 2 chemicals and they explode. T-Stoff, hydrogen peroxide, C-Stoff, hydrazine and methanol, hydrazine, methanol, hideously corrosive and unbelievably volatile. Fueling was life-threatening. Ground crews in protective suits, 1 drop on skin would dissolve it. If fuels mixed outside the chamber, detonation. Comets exploded on runways, and during refueling, survivors of takeoff had about 6 to 8 minutes of powered flight. That's it, 8 minutes. After that, you became a glider, a very fast glider. 1 firing pass on a bomber formation, then glide back to base with no engine power and try to land. Landing was another nightmare. No conventional landing gear. Took off on a jettisonable dolly. Landed on a retractable skid. No brakes, couldn't taxi. Skid to a halt on the grass. A sitting duck. Allied fighters waited. They pounced when comets ran out of fuel, shooting them down like birds. Despite speed, Comet was a combat failure. Cannons, less than 3 seconds of firing time. Speed difference made aiming almost impossible. Final tally, about 16 Allied aircraft shot down, for the loss of at least 10 Comets in combat, and many more in training and operational accidents. It killed more of its own pilots than the enemy, a terrifying but ultimately useless weapon. We return to the United States for number 4, a plane whose name would become, tragically ironic, the Douglas TBD Devastator. It entered service in 1937 and was a revolution. The first all-metal monoplane torpedo bomber on carriers. Packed with modern features, hydraulically folding wing. For a brief period it was the pride of the fleet, but aviation technology raced ahead. By the Battle of the Coral Sea, it was already outdated. By the Battle of Midway in 1942, it was a relic. It was painfully slow. Top speed was barely over 200 miles per hour. With a torpedo, it often struggled under 100 miles per hour. That slowness was basically a death sentence. To drop a torpedo, it had to fly low, slow, and straight. That made it an easy target for anti-aircraft guns, and for swarms of agile Japanese Zero fighters. Pilots were essentially on suicide missions, flying through a storm of steel. The plane's defensive armament was a joke: a single forward-firing machine gun, and one flexible rear machine gun, completely inadequate against cannon-armed Zeros. The biggest flaw was the torpedo, the Mark 13. It was notoriously unreliable. It often ran deeper than it was set, or it failed to explode on impact. Pilots were sacrificing their lives to deliver a weapon that might not even work. The tragic climax came at the Battle of Midway. 41 Devastators were launched, from 3 American carriers. They went in without fighter escort, met by Zeros and heavy anti-aircraft fire. Of the 41 that took off, only 6 returned. Not a single torpedo hit a Japanese ship. It was a slaughter. An entire generation of naval aviators was wiped out in hours. The Devastator was withdrawn from frontline service after Midway. Its poor performance actually helped the American attack, in a terrible way. The torpedo squadrons drew Japanese cap down low, leaving the skies clear for American dive bombers. Those dive bombers sank 4 Japanese carriers. The battle changed the course of the war, a devastating legacy, written in the blood of its crews. The Devastator was replaced by the Grumman TBF Avenger. For number 3 on our list of flying disasters, we journeyed to Italy, a country known for beautiful cars, but this time a dreadful aeroplane. Say hello to the Caproni CA.135, a medium bomber from the mid-1930s. From afar, it looks like a bomber. 2 engines, wings, a tail. All the basic components are there, but up close, the trouble starts. The CA.135 was plagued by nearly every aircraft problem. First, the engines. Isotta Fraschini radial engines, underpowered, staggeringly unreliable, barely enough thrust to get airborne and prone to failing at the worst moments, like takeoff. Performance? Pathetic. Pilots called the handling vicious, unstable, difficult to fly, prone to uncontrollable spins. Control surfaces, heavy and unresponsive. Flying it was a full-body workout, a constant terrifying fight to keep it pointed, exhausting and nerve-wracking. Build quality? Shoddy. Reports of structural failures, systems malfunctioning, parts not fitting together, a plane that seemed to fall apart in mid-air. The Regia Aeronautica said, "No grazie," they refused it. Solution? Sell it. Exports to Peru, exports to Hungary. Peru, used in the border war with Ecuador, poor performance revealed. Hungary, sent to the Eastern Front, hopelessly outclassed, heavy losses. Crews hated them. A textbook failed design, underpowered, unstable, unreliable, poorly built, failed specs, rejected by its primary user, then pawned off on allies, who discovered how awful it was. Reminder, making Lamborghinis doesn't stop you from building a lemon with wings. Nearing the top of our list at number 2, we have a Soviet creation that was so despised by its own pilots, they came up with a grimly clever acronym for it. The plane is the Lavochkin-Gorbunov-Gudkov Lag-3. Its pilots, however, knew it as the Lakirovani Garantirovani Grob, which translates to the varnished guaranteed coffin. When the men flying it call it that, you know you have a serious problem. The Lag-3 was a product of desperation. In 1941, as the Germans invaded, the Soviet Union needed modern fighters fast. There was a critical shortage of strategic materials like aluminium alloys. So the Lag-3 was built primarily out of wood, a resin-impregnated plywood called delta wood. This made it heavy. Very, very heavy. All that weight was dragged by a Klimov M105 inline engine that was underpowered. The power-to-weight ratio was dreadful. The Lag-3 was sluggish. It couldn't climb well, it couldn't accelerate well, it wasn't particularly maneuverable. It was, in short, a pig. A heavy wooden pig against the sleek metal greyhounds of the Luftwaffe. Bf-109S, FW-190S. The results were predictable and brutal. In the opening stages of Operation Barbarossa, Lag-3 squadrons were eviscerated. The performance gap was just too great. Soviet pilots, many inexperienced rookies, were thrown into combat in a plane that gave them no chance. They complained it was hard to get out of a spin, and that the plane bled energy in turns, leaving them vulnerable. Even Stalin is said to have noticed the reputation. A story says he sent a telegram to factories building the WWII, demanding to know why they were building duds and warning managers of consequences. The pressure was immense, but a fundamentally flawed design has limits. The WWII is a sad tale of compromise gone wrong, an attempt to build a modern fighter without the materials. The result was inferior in almost every respect. Later versions with stronger engines and lighter frames improved things, but the name was already cursed. The varnished guaranteed coffin stands as proof that in aerial combat, being second best is a death sentence. It wasn't just a bad plane, it was a symbol of the desperate, bloody struggle on the Eastern Front. And so we arrive at number 1. The absolute pinnacle of aeronautical ineptitude. The undisputed champion of terrible aeroplanes. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the Italian WWII Lince, or Lynx. This aircraft is not just bad, it is a failure on such a monumental, almost comical scale. It is the gold standard by which all other failed aircraft are judged. When the prototype first flew in 1936, it was a world beater. It was sleek, it was fast, and it broke several world speed records. The Italian propaganda ministry went into overdrive, hailing it as the finest attack aircraft on the planet. The future looked bright. The Italian Air Force ordered it into production, and that is when everything, and I mean everything, went catastrophically wrong. The production version was nothing like the prototype. To turn it into a military aircraft, they had to add military equipment, guns, bomb racks, radios, armor. All this stuff adds weight, a lot of weight. The sleek, record-breaking prototype ballooned into a morbidly obese, hopelessly overweight production model. The 2 Piaggio radial engines, which were adequate for the prototype, were now completely overwhelmed. The performance didn't just drop, it fell off a cliff, it tumbled down a mountain, and it drowned in the sea. The top speed was abysmal, the rate of climb was non-existent, but here is the truly astonishing part. When fully loaded with military equipment, some BA.88s could not even take off. Or if they did manage to struggle into the air, they were unable to climb or even maintain level flight. In 1940, a handful of these disasters were sent to North Africa for combat operations. On their very first mission, the crews discovered that the special dust filters fitted for desert operations choked the engines so badly that they lost even more power. The mission was aborted. After a few weeks of trying to get the planes to work, the commander on the ground sent a telegram back to Rome that read, in essence, "These planes are useless, the entire operational fleet of BA." 88S was flown back to Italy, stripped of any useful equipment, and then simply parked on dummy airfields to act as decoys for Allied bombers. That was its only useful contribution to the war. To be blown up on the ground so that a proper airplane wouldn't be. It was a failure so complete, so total, that the Italian Air Force ordered the program terminated and all existing airframes to be scrapped. The WWII Lince wasn't just the worst aircraft of World War II, it might just be the worst combat aircraft of all time. So there you have it. 10 of the most dreadful, dangerous, and downright disappointing aircraft to ever stain the skies of the Second World War. From turret fighters that couldn't fight to bombers that couldn't bomb, it's a powerful reminder that for every legend, there's a lemon. Not every plane can be a Spitfire or Mustang. Some are remembered for all the wrong reasons. These machines weren't just failures of engineering, they were death traps that cost the lives of many brave airmen who deserved far better. These planes represent the dark side of wartime innovation. Bad ideas, bureaucratic meddling, and desperate compromises led to unmitigated disasters. They are the footnotes in history, the cautionary tales whispered by engineers and pilots. But their stories are just as important as those of the war winners, teaching us valuable lessons about what not to do when you're designing something that has to fly and fight for its life. It's a miracle some of these even got off the drawing board, let alone into combat. But that's just my list. What do you think? Did I miss any spectacular failures? Is there a flying catastrophe that you think deserves a spot in this hall of shame? Let me know your picks for the worst World War II aircraft in the comments below. I'd love to read them. Thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoy diving into the more unusual corners of military history, please consider subscribing for more content. Until next time, fly safe and try to avoid anything made of varnished wood.